Christian nationalists are mobilizing. They want to turn America into a Christian theocracy. Our secular democracy is in danger. All personal liberties are in jeopardy. Vote like your rights depend on it. And join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an association of atheists and agnostics working to keep religion and government separate.
Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. It is spooky season, and this week we're getting into the Halloween spirit to give you a last-minute warning of the horrors of Project 2025. Joining me today is FFRF's Senior Policy Counsel, Ryan Jayne. Ryan, hi.
Hey, Liz. It's a good spooktacular day today.
It is. Prepare to be scared. As always, we want to hear your thoughts on topics we discussed today, so please leave your questions in the chat below, or you can email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show.
We'd like to kick this episode off with a video by Congressman Jared Huffman, who helped launch the Stop Project 2025 task force earlier this year. In this video, he breaks down some of the more alarming policies within the 922-page mandate.
Over the past year, Americans have heard a lot about two things: Project 2025 and the rise of Christian nationalism. I want to talk today about how these threats are deeply intertwined. Anyone who's looked into Project 2025 can see that it's an unprecedented takeover plan to gut checks and balances that hold our democracy together in order to roll back fundamental rights, erode the separation of church and state, and impose draconian policies that are deeply unpopular with most Americans. All of this plays perfectly into the vision that Christian nationalists have been working toward for years. Page 13 implies that religious values should be infused into every level of the government's decision-making. Page 494 begins the calls, which appear in numerous places in Project 2025, for the dismantling of civil rights protections in the name of religious liberty, providing schools, healthcare providers, employers, and even adoption agencies a license to discriminate. Page 586, another example, lays out an executive order to allow religious employers to discriminate against employees on the basis of their religious beliefs in ways that are illegal for everyone else. Pages 477 to 482 push for a fundamentalist view of family structure and marriage, mandating the federal government to adopt a, quote, biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family, which Project 2025 defines as only a marriage between a man and a woman. Now on page 333, 475, and 584, Project 2025 rescinds non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ Americans. It disregards the rights of millions by requiring the government to adopt a, quote, biological binary meaning of sex. On page 459, Project 2025 resurrects a Victorian-era law. This was precisely the law that was abused to unconstitutionally restrict publications, books, and other things that discussed women's rights, reproductive health, queerness, and other topics that offended the puritanical sensibilities of Christian politicians more than a century ago. Project 2025 turns the Department of Health and Human Services into the, quote, Department of Life, and it would be tasked with upholding traditional heterosexual marriages and undermining access to reproductive health care, including abortion, birth control, fertility care, and sexual health services. Pages 326 to 352 put the Bible into the classroom by funneling public education dollars into private religious schools, prohibiting accrediting bodies from requiring standards that, quote, conflict with the religious mission or religious beliefs of the institutions, end quote. And this would include, for example, teaching the actual science of evolution instead of the religious theory of creationism. and allowing teachers in federally run schools under Project 2025 to run their classrooms according to their faith, regardless of the impact on students or parents. It is so extreme, but it goes on. Page 589 follows up on the proposal to slash overtime pay for millions of Americans with a special exception for Christians. It requires employers to provide overtime on the God-ordained Sabbath, which Project 2025 naturally declares as Sunday, unless, that is, an employer has a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath at a different time. This agenda may seem strange, even surreal, but it's a deadly serious scheme to take control over our lives. Project 2025 would force America into a place where one religious ideology dictates how we all live. This is not how our secular constitutional republic was founded, and it's not what the American people want.
So that was kind of terrifying, and if you think so too, stay tuned. We're going to be discussing a lot more about some of the things that were mentioned in that video. Specifically, there are a few things that Representative Huffman mentioned there that deserve to be repeated and discussed a bit more. First of all, the general scheme of Project 2025 is to go agency by agency, one by one, through the federal government and talk about what they're going to do with each one. And if you know anything about the federal government, you know it's a giant, sprawling entity. So we're going to get into some of the specifics, but also, Liz, do you want to speak really briefly about kind of who is behind Project 2025 and why that might be a little bit concerning?
Yeah. So I think it's always helpful to always ask the question, well, who's behind it? Because sometimes we see these confusing or maybe things that don't seem they're directly related to state-church separation, or they're a little bit off the typical Christian nationalist message. But it's helpful to understand that the people behind Project 2025, we know that many of you have probably heard that Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative, think tank policy organization, actually drafted and is hosting Project 2025. But they have what they call the Project 2025 Advisory Board, which is basically, and they themselves discuss the project as sort of a coalition effort amongst all of these like-minded organizations. And it's all the usual suspects that are constantly seeking to undermine state-church separation and to instill Christian nationalist ideology into the government. It's the Alliance Defending Freedom, it's First Liberty Institute, it's Liberty University, it's the James Dobson Institute, it's all the really extreme pro-life organizations, Susan B. Anthony, it's Moms for Liberty, it's all of the far-right, often white Christian nationalist organizations that are working to do all of the things that Representative Huffman was describing, right? Taking all the lawsuits that seek to dismantle the public schools, undermine our civil rights protections, fund religious organizations with tax dollars, all of those things. And that is the coalition behind Project 2025. So that tells you a lot right up front.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is that the intent of this largely is to overwhelm, right? It's a almost 1,000-page document, and there's so much there that you can't possibly respond to all of it. So the thing to keep in mind with all of these groups behind it that have this Christian nationalist agenda is that regardless of what it actually says in this document that we're trying to identify and respond to, the reality is that the biggest threat is these groups getting behind the levers of power, because they're not going to be limited to what their laid out plans are in Project 2025. So that's the main thing to my mind, is that you don't want the Alliance Defending Freedom calling the shots. That's the biggest single takeaway from Project 2025 to me. We're going to identify some of the very specific things that are incredibly concerning, but to me that's the biggest single takeaway, is just we do not want these people to be calling the shots for the United States.
Very important point. And also, before we dig into some of the specifics, the other kind of scene setting I wanted to do is just kind of the crash course in not administrative law, because I don't want, this is Halloween, but we don't want to scare people.
Yeah, that's too scary.
Scare people away that much. But just what this is a roadmap to. So when we talk about how Project 2025 goes through federal agency by federal agency to lay out its plans, what we're talking about is just crash course, this is just agency action 101, is Congress passes laws, right, to set the rules for how so many things in our lives are going to be, right? So like Congress passes the Civil Rights Act in the 60s, and it protects, our civil rights in public places, or Congress passes laws regulating whether or not polluters can pollute our air and water. And Congress can't legislate every single detail that's ever going to come up, and it can't really put those laws into practice, right? So the laws are scaffolding, and the Congress delegates the authority to put those laws into practice for our lives to federal agencies. Those federal agencies exist under the executive branch. They operate under the authority of the executive branch. So it matters a lot how the executive branch functions, because every single agency that puts laws into practice that affect our lives, so the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, so many more that we're going to talk about, all fall under this sort of mantle that Project 2025 is aimed right at. And many of the things in Project 2025 do not require congressional action to achieve. They are aimed at taking power through these agencies via the executive branch. Some of the things in Project 2025, some of the ideas would require congressional action, but most of them would not.
That's right. And if you know anything about Congress, you might know that they are famously inactive. They don't typically get anything done. So this administrative law area, as scary or boring as it may sound, is actually where most of the action happens in the federal government. We should also note really quickly that the Freedom from Religion Foundation is a 501c3, as is the Heritage Foundation. So we are not discussing this in the context of any political parties or candidates. We are just talking about the Heritage Foundation's giant set of bad ideas and why they're bad.
Yeah, and it's a policy agenda, right? They brand it as sort of a playbook for the next administration that's willing to take up their super Christian nationalist ideas and policy agenda proposals, and it's very extreme. But again, they're not necessarily aiming it at a particular administration or a particular candidate in the election. They're just laying it all out there as their playbook for the next conservative administration. On the podcast, on the We Dissent podcast, we call it the roadmap to hell. And so Ryan and I are going to get into some of the specifics that Jared Huffman was alluding to, and why, if you care about secular democracy and state-church separation, Project 2025 should really, really scare you.
And so the first one we can get into that Huffman mentioned is the license to discriminate issues. So there is this idea that under the guise of religious liberty, you can discriminate in various forms depending on what your position is. So Representative Huffman mentioned schools, healthcare providers, employers, and adoption agencies. This is just a few ideas. Liz, do you want to give an example of how this might come up in practice?
Yeah, so you have maybe caught wind of some of these battles that are already playing out in the courts. So all the advisory board member organizations we talked about up at the top are also in courts filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit to try and get the courts to find that ultra-conservative Christian actors, either employers or pharmacists or teachers or cake shop bakery owners or wedding website designers, have the right to discriminate even if the law requires them not to, because they have a religious reason for wanting to discriminate. So we're already seeing these battles being played out. Project 2025 seeks to just kind of cut out the courts, cut out the Constitution, go right to the laws that prevent discrimination, and just wave an executive wand, create executive orders that say, actually, anyone with a religious objection to not discriminating across all of these fields is free to do so. They can't be required by law. And this is important because pretty much nearly, not all, but nearly all states in the country have some or many anti-discrimination laws on the books. If you live in a municipality like Madison, you have ordinances on the books that protect you from discrimination on certain bases, on the basis of sex, on the basis of race, on the basis of religion, sexual orientation in many places. And this seeks to roll back the clock on all of those civil rights protections, including the Federal Civil Rights Act, which was passed in the 60s. Project 2025 would roll back the clock on that and just say, actually, anyone who has a religious basis for discriminating, it doesn't matter where or against whom or for what reason, the law can't stop you.
And in the history of the civil rights movement, you saw that the entities that wanted to discriminate, the forces that were fighting against the civil rights movement, consistently had a religious argument on their side. It wasn't their only argument, but it was consistently present, where they would say the reason that we can't be integrating our schools is because of some sort of religious belief. And so this would basically go back to that point and undo, because at the time, courts just rejected that argument out of hand. They said, no, your religion cannot be a justification for you to just be treating your students or your patients differently. But this would undo all of that and say, no, actually, as long as you say magical religious words, you can discriminate as much as you want.
That's right. And like Ryan said, there's nothing new about these arguments. They were used to try to undermine laws that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, as well as school desegregation. But again, they're getting new purchase in today's political world, because the rise of white Christian nationalism at the seat of power, including in our courts, has really given these arguments new life as they sort of try to take on discrimination, anti-discrimination laws that are protecting us against discrimination on the basis of sex or sexual orientation. But of course, there's nothing in these arguments that would protect race-based discrimination or any other type of discrimination, right? This would just be rolling back the clock wholesale.
Yep, that's right. And of course, in practice, one of the most immediate threats when you talk about rolling back anti-discrimination laws is to the LGBTQ plus community. And so that ties into the next point that Representative Huffman mentioned, which is requiring the federal government to adopt a biblically based definition of marriage and family. So this also would have a sweeping effect, touching on a whole bunch of different areas. So just to mention one, he mentioned adoption agencies, and right now there are big battles going on. It's already a fight for whether religiously owned adoption agencies that take federal money can discriminate, and some of them want to discriminate on the basis of religion. So we've seen like Christian adoption agencies that don't want to adopt kids to Jewish couples, even if they're heterosexual. But there's also, of course, adoption agencies that are saying if you're a same-sex couple, don't even bother applying.
Yep. And again, doing that with tax dollars is what the issue is in that particular case. But again, the biblically based framing of family and marriage in Project 2025, I think it's really important. So you and I both have, because of our life choices, had to read most or all of the Project 2025 to be able to talk about it, comment on it, or try to gather what the white Christian nationalist threats are in there. And I think it's really striking, if you do that, how it really is the through line, because really, of course, it's dense. It goes agency by agency. Some of it really reads like dry, kind of policy agenda type stuff. But every single section comes back to some sort of very biblical framing. It's very religious biblical Christian conservative language used to sort of give the the whereas, the why behind all of the policies is this really biblically based view and prioritization of family, and by which Project 2025 means a man, a woman, and their biological children that have binary sex. It's very specific, and it's not just in individual. Yes, it goes throughout all the HHS funding programs, right? We're going to prioritize. We're going to use funding, the power of the purse, to force people into these definitions. But it's also just the ideology behind the whole entire document, right? Like, the reason for America is to pursue the traditional ideal of family. Like, that type of language runs throughout the whole entire thing, right? Like, not just, oh, these are our priorities, but America is only a place for traditional biblical families.
Yeah, and those of us who've been fighting state church battles for a while have seen this line of thought with things like In God We Trust being on the currency, where when it gets challenged in court, they try to downplay that and they say, oh, that's just symbolic. It doesn't really mean anything. But as soon as they're done defending it on paper that way, it immediately gets turned around and they say, we told you this is a Christian nation, just pull out a dollar bill. And what does it say right there?
Right.
So it's like, this has always been the playbook of Christian nationalists, is to try to work in this biblical religious language so that they try to downplay it when it's challenged and say, well, this is just historical or it's just symbolic. It's
ceremonial.
It's ceremonial, yep. But then when push comes to shove, they want to do the exact opposite and use this as justification to do whatever they want and say, look, this is a Christian nation. You can look at the religious language that is just, throughout all of the documents. So that's what they're trying to do, is to kind of change the seeds of all these laws to kind of plant these biblical seeds.
Right. And it is. It completely adopts, Project 2025 completely adopts this, reimagined American history in terms of what the founders intended, what the purpose of government is, and what the sort of the promises of America were meant. So, like, I'm thinking of this one example. It's horrifying, where the language is that the founders didn't, I'm paraphrasing, but this comes from the document. The founders, when they said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what they meant by pursuit of happiness was the pursuit of blessedness. In other words, like the pursuit of a biblical life. That's just full-on revisionist history, but that's the ideology that is undergirding all of the policy that follows.
Yeah, and it's also in line with the work that we've been doing recently to fight against attempts to put the Ten Commandments in public schools and to mandate that public school teachers teach the Bible. I think it's the same idea, the same motivation, is to rewrite history and to get at, in that case, kids when they're very young, and say, don't you remember in your government-funded public school that there were the Ten Commandments right there, and there were biblical lessons. So see, this really is a Christian nation, and the goal of pursuit of happiness being basically to make the Christian God happy. It's just
right.
Very concerning.
Right. This language is in the document. You were not meant by pursuit of happiness to be free to do what you want, but free to do what you ought. Mm-hmm. And ought obviously means ought by, like, biblical, by God's standards,
right.
Our God's standards. So it's very explicit. It's not subtle.
Yeah, or maybe by the standards of someone like Anthony Comstock, who is something else we can mention, who is the person behind the Comstock Act, a Civil War era law that is one of these laws that's on the books, even though most people have agreed for a long time that it hasn't been enforceable, so Congress hasn't bothered to repeal it. But there's a real danger when you play that game that at some point someone might crop up and say, this is still on the books, maybe we can actually enforce this.
Right.
And so now that we are in this post-Roe world after Dobbs, all of a sudden reproductive rights are in absolute crisis. And the Christian nationalists behind Project 2025 are looking at the Comstock Act and saying, actually, this looks like we might already have a effective national abortion ban on the books. All we have to do is start enforcing it.
Right. And so for all of our audience members who are not 150 years old, the Comstock Act was, the moral panic act of its time, passed in 1873, I think, and named after Anthony Comstock, who was the, sex-obsessed, puritanical white man of his day. And it was a law that banned, so it would be a criminal law that could be enforced, a law that banned using the post, the mail services, to send immoral materials, which defined in the day was birth control devices that existed at the time, pamphlets about contraception and birth control and things of that nature, information or things that were considered to be abortifacients of the time, or even just information about those subjects. And of course, it has not been enforced in years and decades upon decades upon decades. It's being seized on as, it's something that's still on the books. It's not been repealed. And in today's world, we could just enforce it against people who use shipping and post to send mifepristone, abortion pills, and contraception, which is a very popular way that people get access to abortion medication and birth control, right? Yeah. Pharmacy by mail is not a foreign concept to anybody for anything, any pharmaceutical that they use. But of course, these immoral, by the standards of Project 2025, things like contraception will be targeted by reviving the Comstock Act. And this is an explicit policy agenda item of Project 2025.
Yeah, and it's, this male medication is an absolute lifeline for so many pregnant people who are in states where suddenly their reproductive health care is not available to them. So it's a really serious life and death situation. And for anyone who would try to, downplay it and say, it's not as serious as we're making it out to be, just to paint a little bit of a picture of how disgusting Anthony Comstock was. At the time that he was around and had gotten this law passed, there were reports that people had been driven to suicide because of this law being enforced against them. And you might think that someone who is behind a law that had that effect would maybe try to backpedal or try to say, well, maybe there's some other justification, try to talk their way around it. But he absolutely embraced it. He thought it was a good thing, and he celebrated that his law had that result. So this is the law that they are talking about starting to enforce again.
Yeah, and with a similar gusto. So it again is a marker of Dobbs was just the beginning, right? Dobbs was not enough, right? The end game is not just overturning Roe versus Wade. It is obliterating all access and criminalizing any way or using all means of government possible to completely eliminate access to not just abortion, but contraception.
Yeah. And along the same lines, there's the Department of Health and Human Services, which Representative Huffman mentioned, that is a major sprawling agency in itself, touches lots of different areas. And Project 2025 contemplates renaming it the Department of Life. So that alone just shows you where their motivations are. And once again, all the details of what that might entail, it's a lot. We'll just say that.
Yeah. And again, it's a massive part of the government, that HHS, Health and Human Services, that directs federal funding to different health and human services priorities that are set by Congress through the agency. And so they would be that. The idea to rename it the Department of Life kind of captures the whole top line of the agenda there, which is to turn it into an anti-abortion pro or, anti-LGBTQ family, anti-diverse family acceptance and anti-abortion arm of the federal government using all of the public dollars that flow through HHS. And it's a lot. I mean, it's like TANF and, the different public dollars that are supposed to go to family support programs. It's all about reframing eligibility for those dollars into, are you in a two-parent heterosexual family? Are you in any way associated with or giving referrals or information about abortion, and taking all of the federal money that flows through HHS and limiting it to prioritize anti-abortion organizations and priorities and anti-LGBT family services.
Yeah, and I mean, healthcare in this country is famously a mess, and it's very confusing, but the important thing to understand is that the Department of Health and Human Services funnels a truckload of federal money through this to the states that go to hospitals and other healthcare providers, and they can tie strings to those dollars. So it should be very alarming to anyone who has any potential healthcare needs, which includes all humans, that you do not want the HHS to be run as if it were some sort of biblical entity.
Right. It's putting this sort of like morality police thrust behind all of these agencies that are just supposed to be doing the government work of helping support programs that we're prioritizing through our congressional members, supporting needy families, trying to address childhood poverty and hunger and healthcare access and all of these things, and putting this whole biblical, morality police agenda behind all of those dollars is really alarming. Yeah. Another thing that Project 2025 is doing that is just a huge policy goal of the Christian nationalist movement is dismantling public education.
Yes, and they specifically actually say, just kind of in passing, that they want to actually literally shut down the Department of Education at the federal level. They would just like to stop that agency from existing at all. So no more federal support for public schools, full stop.
Yep, no more FAFSA, no more any of the support that comes through the Department of Education for Head Start and all of the early education programs that states rely on federal dollars for. Department of Education fully dissolved.
Yep, and this is in line with what we've seen at the state level, which is a goal to expand private school vouchers, which are basically, these are schemes to take money that ought to be going to public schools and instead divert them to private schools, the vast majority of which are religious. And they know that it's not constitutional to be directly funding religious instruction, so they try to get around that with this idea of, well, we're giving the funds to parents that can choose any private school they want, knowing full well that the only options are typically religious schools, and usually in most areas it's a particular brand of religious schools.
Right. And again, if you've heard us probably talk on this program and elsewhere about the abject failure that is the school voucher, school choice movement experiment, this would just expand that, which means decreasing or giving worse outcomes to students and kids, while taking much needed funding out of our public schools and diverting it to by and large religious schools, all the while dismantling all of any accrediting standards that exist for private schools that receive federal funding on the grounds that they violate the religious freedom of the schools that are receiving public money. So what little accreditation or strings are attached to money that go to religious schools now, Project 2025 and its, Christian nationalist utopia would do away with all of that. Just taxpayer money to religious schools, no strings attached. Public schools can be left to wither and die.
Yeah, and just because that, I think that's a subtle point in a way that can be easily missed, is that we have background studies that have shown that voucher programs do not improve the academic performance of students. So it's not good for academic outcomes when you move kids from public schools to voucher schools. But at least there are some safeguards that certain private schools need to be accredited, and this varies state by state, but there's some federal limits or requirements there as well. And what Liz was just saying was that this would remove those if a school had a religious objection to the accreditation requirements. The federal government comes in and says, we are not going to say you're an accredited school because you don't meet basic standards. If the school can articulate a religious reason for why it doesn't want to follow those rules, then it is entitled to accreditation.
Right, exactly. And again, this is an objective that these actors are trying to achieve in the courts right now, right? They're pushing to be able to receive after the Supreme Court held that they had to, or that states have to include religious schools in general funding schemes in Carson versus Macon. They can't be excluded just because they're sectarian. Now, that's not enough, right? The religious schools don't only want access to taxpayer money, they don't want to abide by, you guessed it, anti-discrimination requirements that states have for schools receiving taxpayer dollars, right? You're free to discriminate in hiring and in enrollment against LGBTQ people, adults and students, but you're not free to do that with tax dollars. But the religious schools want both, and Project 2025 would give it to them.
Yeah, so it's definitely one of the most damaging aspects. Another incredibly damaging one is climate change denial. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, as most viewers probably know, does really, really important work to try to protect our environment. And the authors behind Project 2025 are largely of a mind that God has promised that he won't destroy the earth again, so this is not something we need to be wasting government resources on. Everything's going to be fine, so we should just get rid of the EPA and get rid of all these burdensome regulations that are supposedly there to help the environment. So needless to say, that is not based in science and not a great idea.
Not a great idea at all. And again, using the power of the EPA, that federal agency, to set the public messaging, right? It went out on, not in Project 2025, but on the training videos that leaked to support the personnel staffing side of Project 2025. That a big part of the training was that at the EPA, we're going to go through and there's going to be no mention, we're going to purge all the mention of man-made climate change. And that's really important because the EPA is not just trying to take action and use funding and projects to support mitigating climate change. They're trying to be leaders and drive a message and build public support to prioritize and mitigate the effects of climate change. And purging the whole idea that man-made climate change is real from our federal government is really radical and harmful.
And that touches on another issue that we haven't even brought up yet, which is that part of the way that Project 2025 contemplates achieving all of this is by replacing career officials at these agencies with people who believe the ideals of Project 2025 and maybe don't have the experience. So at EPA, for instance, you have all sorts of climate scientists and people who are actually experts on this issue who've been working there for decades, and they know this stuff better than anybody else. And part of the idea of Project 2025 is they don't want those people to be roadblocks when they come in and try to impose the Heritage Foundation's ideology. So they're just going to recategorize those positions so they can replace those people with people who believe what they do. And so that was the idea behind these training videos, is just, a lot of it, it was really terrifying because it's is really basic stuff where it's like, so you might be getting a position as a senior official at the EPA. Here's where your stapler is, and here's where your phone is. You know, like here's like the most basics of your new government position when you come in to run a federal agency.
Right.
So really scary stuff.
Right. And again, as Ryan's alluding to, this 922-page document is one prong of a four-prong project. The personnel database is another one. The training videos are a third. The personnel database, by the way, is tens of thousands of names on a list that hasn't been made public of people that fit this litmus test that Ryan just described. Right? They are white Christian nationalist ideologues that are willing to do the bidding of Project 2025, and it doesn't matter. There's no other experience required besides that one. And that's the database that the agencies will all be staffed from if Project 2025 gains a foothold in our government. And then the fourth prong is a transition plan. It's not been made public, unlike the mandate. It's a transition plan for the next administration that would be willing to put Project 2025 into action.
Yep. And so I think one maybe last specific thing we can touch on before we turn and take a look at audience questions is this idea with the Department of Labor that the federal government would require employers to provide overtime on the Christian Sabbath. So it's not just accommodating your employees for if they have a request to take a particular day off, but it's specifically saying that the Christian Sabbath, Sunday, needs to be the day that if you make people work there, you have to give them overtime. And as Huffman mentioned, the only exception is if the employer has a religious objection to that and wants a different day, then maybe they'll talk about that.
I know, and it's great because that particular section is one of those places where the biblical language, the Christian ideology that's like the reason for the policy decision is right there, right? It's like, because I was just looking for it because I want to quote it, but it's like, because God rested on, the seventh day, and this is like a sacred day, the Sabbath, we should get Congress to, this is one that would require congressional action. We should get Congress to amend the Fair Labor Standard Act to require employers to give overtime on Sunday, the Sabbath, unless, another Sabbath. But, the default Sabbath is our Sabbath. And here's why, because God rested. And that's the whole reason for nothing else. Like, there's no attempt to even create any kind of secular basis for why we would want to amend a law to require employers to pay overtime in this way. It's all about supporting this one specific religion's way of life and forcing it onto the rest of us and our employers, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and you can see this too if you take the entire document and you do a Control F and look up, Christianity or Christian, you'll see tons of references just peppered throughout the entire thing. As we've been talking about, there's references to biblical purposes and Christianity and everything. But if you do a Control F for Hindu or Muslim, what you'll find are almost nothing, but the things you do find are negative. So they have some concerns about Islamic terrorism,
yes,
or about the Islamic Republic of Iran's nuclear capabilities. So it pops up because they're afraid of those other religions, but
right.
So they're not really hiding the Christian affiliation behind the entire plan.
Right. And it is, like, it's important to, we don't obviously have time to get into every specific in this, less than an hour-long show, although we'll give resources in a minute for anyone that wants to learn more. I think it is really important to also, to never, lose sight of what the broader context for Project 2025, which is that it is a manifesto for transforming our secular democracy into a white Christian nationalist authoritarian state. And that is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what it is. It's explicitly so, right? It's not subtle. This is not us reading between the lines. It is all kind of right there, even though it's hard to get through and it's overwhelming and dense. That is all right there plain for any of us to read and see what the plan is.
Yeah, and these people who author these various sections, are either they or their close allies are going to be potential frontrunners gunning for the positions of being the head of these various agencies. So that's the other thing that's just terrifying is, you know, we talk about the EPA and you can get into all the specific concerns, but the biggest thing and the simplest point to keep in mind is just if the person who wrote this section is appointed to be the secretary of the Environmental Protection Agency, then forget all the details. Just this is over, right? The EPA is not going to function if the person who wrote this is running it, and that's the biggest threat to my mind. The most immediate thing is if the authors behind this plan get into those positions of power.
Right. It's the ideology that you can see there, because whatever's in the playbook, you know, it's the authors of the playbook that are going to be sitting at the levers of power in all of those agencies if they have their way. So I want to take some questions, and then we'll give some resources. Let's see what's on people's minds about Project 2025. Again, we are not going to talk about the election or candidates, but we can talk about people's questions about specifics on the policy. Here's one. This is an interesting question. Isn't Project 2025 unconstitutional? There's so many different policies in there. You'd have to go through one by one.
Yeah.
But I think the instinct there is right. There is a lot in Project 2025 that we would argue, or even that would be found today, to be unconstitutional. So you're hitting on something important there, but I think it raises an important point about why Project 2025 is so dangerous.
Right, and I think there's a number of different arguments there, and it's an interesting thing to think about, and what I think should be the strongest argument for why all the things we've been discussing should be unconstitutional is because of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That's why all this biblically based stuff, back when we had what we called the Lemon Test, the first prong of it was that government acts cannot have a primarily religious purpose. Right. And that would strike this down right there. We would just say, yeah, the Establishment Clause prevents you from implementing all these rules with the purpose of imposing Christian nationalism. That should be pretty easy. Unfortunately, the current context is a bit more complicated than that because of a Supreme Court that's quite hostile to the Establishment Clause. So in theory, I think the answer is yes, we would agree with you that the Establishment Clause ought to come in and protect people's right to a secular government, but it's not so simple. So we would have to come up with alternative arguments. But with that said, I guess it is a good thing to make sure that we do note that in the event that all these scary eventualities happen that we're discussing, FFRF will be there to be fighting this for every inch of ground that it tries to gain. So we will be the ones out there making these arguments that every specific Project 2025 aspect that they try to implement is unconstitutional or violates the Administrative Procedures Act or any other argument that needs to be made to try to stop or slow it down. We will absolutely be fighting those battles.
That's right. You're reminding me, Ryan, of a really important kind of feature of this whole agenda that I wanted to point out. And Representative Huffman kind of alludes to this at the end of the video we showed, which is this is something that is truly radical and also that the American people don't want. I think it's important to highlight that this is an agenda for jamming into American law and society an agenda that is not popular, and it's through it's kind of a furtherance of the anti-democratic nature of the whole white Christian nationalist project, which has captured most of the federal bench, including a majority of the Supreme Court. That's why we see these decisions come down from the Supreme Court, and everyone is like, you know, why do I have to live by these rules set by these 9 people that the majority of Americans don't agree with, right? The majority of Americans don't agree with Dobbs, yet that's the law of the land. It's because The Supreme Court has become a very anti-democratic institution, right? It's not submitting itself to oversight by the other branches of government. And so we have it getting more and more anti-democratic. The same thing is what Project 2025 seeks to do to the executive branch or the agencies that give life to congressional action by the executive branch, is to take over them so that they can do things that can't be achieved through congressional action because nobody wants them, right? It's like, where can we go with our agenda that doesn't require popular support? And it's the administrative state, because it's expanding the power of the executive branch to enact these policies without congressional approval, because knowing that the vast majority of people don't want to live by these biblical, morality police standards. And so I think that's an important feature of Project 2025, is that it's meant to convert the way our administrative state operates now into a anti-democratic one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's deeply undemocratic and unpopular, and it also should remind people of the outsized influence in our system that Christian nationalists have, and that's something that the nones, the NONES, the non-religious Americans, who are a bigger chunk of the society than we ever have been before, could take away from them, right? This is one of the nice things about democracy, is if we mobilize correctly, this is one aspect we can change, is the outsized influence that Christian nationalists have. It's very unpopular, but it takes a concerted effort to take those reins of power out of their hands.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to, since we're getting close to the hour, I'm going to just remind anyone watching that if you want to learn more about Project 2025, there are lots of resources out there breaking it down. We're kind of highlighting just a couple that we recommend. One is the ACLU, which has an explainer, some suggestions on how you can take action if you're worried about Project 2025.
And Democracy Forward has a People's Guide to Project 2025 that's very helpful. We'll have all the links for those resources in the description below.
And again, I want to just say thank you to Ryan Jayne for joining me to give this wonderful Halloween-themed, spooky episode explainer on Project 2025. It is neither a trick nor a treat. It is a nightmare, and we should all mobilize against it and keep informed about the threats of Project 2025 and how it will affect your life if it comes to pass. But that wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. You can learn more about Project 2025 this week during our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with Alex Aronson, Executive Director of Court Accountability. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And a new episode of our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, airs this weekend. Annie Laurie and Dan will talk to religious studies scholar Matthew D. Taylor about his new book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy.
That the will of God is that X person be elected, and then they're willing to take anti-democratic action, as we saw on January 6th, and really as we saw in the entire Stop the Steal campaign. That undermines the very foundations of how we understand democracy. I am totally fine with Christians and even charismatic Christians voting and participating in our democracy. I think that is part of the basic freedoms, part of the basic pluralism of our society. The challenge is when people decide that God is telling them that they need to overturn the current regime or hold on to power even after the democratic will of the people has said it's time for you to leave.
You'll be able to watch that episode soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent. It is the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you so much. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.